Well, it's interesting. I think obviously there are challenges that are imposed from outside. So Indigenous communities in virtually every situation that I'm aware of have to deal with an external set of constraints. They're dealing with governments that hold a great deal of power. They're dealing with, in many cases, with governments that hold the purse strings, that control the funds they need to do almost anything. So they're serious external constraints, and if you can't persuade those governments to open up some of the space within which you can effectively govern, then you may be in trouble. It's very hard to do that, to find that space. Then, though, once you open up that space, and that's to me is what self-determination is about. Self-determination is about finding the space where you can assert your own agenda and pursue it in your own way. Once you've got that space, though, then the question is, how do you fill it? What kinds of governing institutions do you bring into that arena? What is the agenda you bring into that arena? How do you pursue it? And those kinds of things those have to be generated from within. And then you're up against some of the internal obstacles. So among those, I would point to things like, let's say in North America, under the Indian Reorganization Act in the United States and the Indian Act in Canada, we've had external power saying, if you want to govern, here's how you need to do it. You need to organize this way with this number of people. You need to have these kinds of meetings. You need this kind of representative system. And that over time, because we've had generations operating under those provisions, over time that gets normalized. It becomes the way people think you govern. To me, that's an impoverished notion of governance. It's an ineffective notion of governance. We know that most of the governments organize that way. There are some exceptions, but most of them don't work very well. They're not effective vehicles for carrying forward the ambitious agendas of Indigenous nations who are trying to make law, to build relationships with outsiders, to educate their children, to do 3, 4, 5 generation planning. They're inadequate to those kinds of things, but you have to deal with this inherited legacy and the way that the assumptions people make about governing. Some of these governments that we've had in a lot of Indigenous communities over the years have become, the battles are over who's going to get the goodies, who's going to get the jobs, the money, the health care, the housing, and so forth, rather than how do we use this government as an instrument for building the future we want for our grandchildren. So you have to get out of those ways of thinking, and I think that requires often powerful leaders who are able to articulate a new way of thinking. It is often assisted by the stories of other nations who've broken out of these received ways of thinking or who have shed some of those ineffective structures and begun to create their own governing structures. Those kinds of stories can be inspirational to nations saying, oh, there is a different way to do this. We don't have to do it that way. And there are alternatives out there. So the challenges in nation building are both external, finding that space where you can actually assert governing power, and then the internal issues show up of, okay, how do we decide what we're trying to do? How do we decide what the tools are we're going to use to do it? How do we get the community on board and get the community out of that kind of dependent victim mentality into a, this is our government, it will be our way, and we will make it work mentality?